In a world already on edge with shifting alliances, economic crises, and the resurgence of nationalism, one voice from Africa has cut across continents with a message that startled political observers everywhere. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young and outspoken leader of Burkina Faso, has once again thrust himself into the global spotlight, this time not for his resistance against foreign interference in Africa or his pursuit of self-sufficiency in his nation, but for his fiery condemnation of policies associated with former United States President Donald Trump, particularly those surrounding taxation, tariffs, and economic nationalism. His words, delivered with the force of conviction and wrapped in the language of justice and equality, have reverberated across continents, leaving analysts, diplomats, and citizens alike debating their meaning, their implications, and their timing. Traoré's speech was not merely an abstract critique of American tax codes or policy choices. It was framed as part of a broader battle for fairness in the global economic system, a system that he argued has been skewed against the global South for decades, with leaders in the West often using taxes, tariffs, and sanctions as weapons to maintain their dominance. By invoking Trump's controversial tax and tariff policies, Traoré not only challenged one of the most polarizing figures in recent global politics, but also used the example to highlight the hypocrisy and inequality embedded in the very structures that govern world trade. The effect was electric. Western capitals expressed outrage or dismissed his remarks as rhetorical grandstanding, while much of the global South, from African capitals to Asian manufacturing hubs, viewed his statement as a bold act of defiance against economic imperialism disguised as domestic policy. In conclusion, the global shock caused by Traoré's condemnation of Trump's taxes was not simply about one leader's critique of another's policies. It was about what those policies symbolize in the broader architecture of global power. For decades, the global South has chafed under economic systems designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor. By invoking Trump, Traoré gave a name and a face to those grievances, crystallizing them in a way that captured global attention. Whether his words will translate into tangible change remains to be seen, but one thing is clear. Traoré has established himself as a voice unwilling to be ignored. His speech has forced a reckoning with the contradictions of globalization and challenged the world to confront the uncomfortable question of whether fairness in the global economy is truly possible when the rules are written by the powerful for their own benefit. The deeper significance of Traoré's condemnation lies in its symbolism. By directly referencing Trump's taxes and tariffs, Traoré elevated what might otherwise be seen as a technical matter of policy into a moral and political issue with global resonance. He reframed taxation not as an internal American debate, but as part of a global struggle over fairness, sovereignty, and justice. In doing so, he placed Burkina Faso, a small West African nation, at the center of a debate about the future of globalization itself. This was perhaps the most shocking aspect of his intervention, that a leader from one of the world's poorest nations could challenge the policies of one of the world's most powerful and do so in a way that commanded global attention. The media response reflected this tension. Western outlets tended to frame Traoré's remarks as provocative or inflammatory, focusing on the audacity of his critique rather than the substance. African and Asian media, by contrast, highlighted the courage of his words and the legitimacy of his concerns. Social media platforms erupted with debate, with hashtags related to Traoré trending in multiple countries. For many young people in Africa, his speech was seen as emblematic of a new generation of leaders unafraid to speak truth to power. For critics, however, it was dismissed as reckless populism that risked destabilizing Burkina Faso's already fragile economy. The economic implications of Traoré's critique also merit attention. By condemning Trump's policies, Traoré effectively positioned Burkina Faso as part of a broader movement within the global South demanding a more just international economic order. This movement includes calls for fairer taxation of multinational corporations, the rejection of exploitative trade deals, and the strengthening of South-South cooperation. In practical terms, Traoré's remarks may encourage African nations to negotiate trade deals with Asian and Latin American partners rather than relying exclusively on Western markets. Already, Burkina Faso has been deepening its ties with China, Russia, and other non-Western powers, seeking investment and trade arrangements that bypass Western-dominated institutions. Traoré's speech, therefore, was not just symbolic but also strategic, signaling his country's orientation toward an alternative global order. Critics, of course, were quick to point out the risks of such rhetoric, condemning Trump and, by extension, U.S. economic policy could alienate potential investors and development partners. Some warned that Burkina Faso risked isolating itself from the very global markets it needs to thrive. Others argued that while Traoré's words may resonate rhetorically, the practical realities of global finance mean that his country cannot simply opt out of the existing system. Yet supporters countered that silence in the face of injustice has done Africa no favors, and that bold voices are needed to challenge the status quo. Traoré, they argued, was stepping into the role of truth-teller, speaking the uncomfortable truths that others are too timid to articulate. But why did Traoré choose this moment? And why frame his critique around Trump's policies rather than the current administration's approach? Some analysts argue that invoking Trump was a calculated choice because of Trump's enduring global notoriety. Even out of office, Trump looms large in debates about globalization, nationalism, and economic fairness. His policies are often remembered as the clearest examples of America First economics. And for Traoré, they offered the perfect symbol of the hypocrisy he sought to expose. Others suggest that Traoré's words may have been aimed at more than just Washington. By invoking Trump, he tapped into global anxieties about the resurgence of populist nationalism, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere. In this way, Traoré's critique was broader, a warning that the weaponization of taxes and tariffs by powerful nations threatens the stability of the global system as a whole. In his extended remarks, Traoré went further, linking taxation to broader themes of sovereignty and independence. He argued that for too long, African nations have been pressured to lower taxes on foreign corporations, open their markets without protections, and adhere to rules dictated by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Meanwhile, when Western leaders like Trump raise barriers to trade, they are celebrated for defending their people. Traoré's rhetorical question was cutting. Why should the United States have the right to defend its industries, but Burkina Faso be denied the right to defend its own farmers and workers? The moral force of the argument was undeniable. Even critics of Traoré admitted that his words captured a truth about global double standards, even if they disagreed with his delivery. Observers noted that Traoré was not merely engaging in anti-American sentiment for its own sake. His critique of Trump's tax policies was part of a larger argument, that global taxation and trade rules are structured in ways that protect wealthy nations at the expense of poorer ones. He pointed to the fact that corporations often shift their profits through tax havens, depriving African nations of billions in potential revenue, while Western governments remain complicit by failing to close loopholes. In this sense, his mention of Trump was strategic. Trump is a polarizing figure whose policies are often viewed as blunt, protectionist, and unapologetically nationalist. By condemning them, Traoré aligned himself with the frustrations of many in the global South who feel squeezed by policies made thousands of miles away. It was less about Trump as an individual and more about what he represented: the unapologetic prioritization of one nation's interests above all others, regardless of global consequences. The shockwaves of Traoré's statement were immediate. In Washington, policymakers downplayed the remarks, some dismissing them as the rhetoric of a leader seeking attention. Yet others worried about the symbolism of a young African president openly challenging U.S. economic policy in such blunt terms. In Africa, however, Traoré's speech was celebrated as a rallying cry. Commentators in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa praised him for daring to say what many leaders whisper privately but fear to articulate publicly: that the global economic system is rigged, and that policies like Trump's tariffs only reinforce an already unequal playing field. In Asia, particularly in Bangladesh and India, Traoré's words resonated with leaders and citizens frustrated by the imposition of Western trade barriers that hurt their industries under the guise of protecting Western workers. Across Latin America, too, analysts noted the parallels with their own struggles against U.S. economic. To understand why Traoré's words struck such a chord, it is necessary to revisit the context of Trump-era taxation and trade policies. During his presidency, Trump introduced sweeping tax cuts domestically, lowering corporate tax rates, and claiming to create a more business-friendly environment within the United States. On the international stage, however, Trump's administration weaponized tariffs, slapping heavy duties on imports from countries like China, European Union members, and even some developing nations. He justified these tariffs as a defense of American workers, railing against what he saw as unfair trade practices and the outsourcing of jobs. Yet for countries like Burkina Faso, dependent on exporting commodities like cotton and gold, such tariffs often meant facing barriers to trade that could devastate local economies. For Traoré, these policies symbolize the larger injustice of a global order where the rules are set in Washington or Brussels, but the pain is felt in Ouagadougou, Dhaka, or Lagos. In his speech, Traoré drew sharp contrasts between the rhetoric of fairness in trade and the reality of power politics. He argued that when the United States or other Western nations impose taxes or tariffs, they frame it as protecting their national interest. But when developing nations attempt to tax foreign corporations operating on their soil, they're branded as corrupt, hostile to investment, or even dictatorial. His words cut deep into the contradictions of the international system. Why, he asked, should the United States be applauded for defending its workers through tariffs, but Burkina Faso be condemned for trying to capture fair revenue from multinational mining companies? The room fell silent as the weight of the question lingered. In that silence, the tension between rhetoric and reality was laid bare.